The doctor passed me a warning. Run. Don't go home. That night, everything changed. Nadia Harrow had lived long enough to recognize the sound of a lie before it finished leaving someone's mouth. 70 years had trained her ears the way storms train a roof. You learn which creaks matter and which are just the house settling. Still, she walked into Dr. Lyle Hartman's clinic that Tuesday believing it would be ordinary. Same pale walls, same antiseptic brightness, same gentle jokes about how she never missed a checkup. 4 years, Lyle had been her steady marker in time, the doctor who had watched her husband's hair silver and later watched him disappear. He had watched Nadia become a widow, then a grandmother, then the quiet centerpiece of a household that somehow revolved around her while never quite seeing her. She expected the routine, blood pressure, a few questions, a brief lecture about salt, and then home to the polite noise of family. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Lyle's hands shook when he wrapped the cuff around her arm. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slightest tremor, the kind people pretend not to notice. He avoided her eyes, spoke too quickly, and when he said her tests were excellent, his voice landed wrong, as if he were reading a line he wished he could erase. Nadia smiled anyway, because a lifetime of keeping peace had taught her to offer comfort even when it wasn't hers to give. When she stood to leave, he stepped close, the way a man does when he needs privacy in a room that claims to provide it. His fingers brushed the edge of her handbag, and something folded slipped into the darkest pocket like a secret sinking to the bottom of a lake. "Take care, Mrs. Harrow," he said, and for the first time in years, he used the formal name as if it were armor. "And remember, sometimes the people closest to you aren't the ones who keep you safe." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Nadia's breath caught, but pride kept her face calm. She walked out with the bag hanging heavy from her shoulder and the feeling that the hallway was suddenly too long. In the taxi, she told herself she was being silly. Doctors had bad days. People got tired. Perhaps he'd lost a patient. Perhaps he was worried about something private. She promised herself she would read whatever he'd slipped into her bag once she reached home, where she could sit at her own table and laugh at her own nerves. The city slid past the window in familiar pieces. The corner bakery, the dry cleaner, the park where she used to push a stroller. She returned to the house she had lived in for decades, the house her late husband had paid off with careful diligence, the house that now held her son, his wife, and her granddaughter like a set of nesting dolls. Inside, the living room fell silent at her arrival as if someone had pinched a flame. Theo, her son, adopted at 2, raised with every ounce of love she owned, stood too straight, and his wife Mara held a stack of papers that vanished behind her back the moment Nadia stepped over the threshold. Their daughter Lila sat on the couch with her phone in hand and a practiced look of innocence that didn't match the tightness around her mouth. "How was the appointment, Mom?" Theo asked. Bright voice, dim eyes. "Perfectly fine," Nadia said. "Strong heart. Good labs." Mara's gaze flicked to Theo in a quick, sharp movement, disappointment flashing like a knife and then disappearing under a polite smile. Lila's voice came out too smooth when she said, "That's great, Grandma. Plenty of time. Plenty of time." Nadia heard the words again later, when the dinner table felt like a stage and her family's good manners sounded rehearsed. Theo spoke little. Mara answered in clipped syllables. Lila avoided looking at Nadia for more than a second. When Nadia asked if something was wrong, Theo smiled and blamed tiredness, and Mara nodded too quickly, as if agreeing was safer than speaking. In her bedroom, Nadia locked the door even though she never had before. The habit shocked her, and then it comforted her. She sat on the edge of the bed with her bag in her lap and found the folded paper in the deep pocket where it had been planted. It was small, handwritten, the ink pressed hard enough to bruise the page. "Mrs. Harrow," it read, "your family visited yesterday. They asked about your mental decline, and whether I could certify you need supervised care. They asked about your assets and what happens if you're declared incompetent. I refused. Do not go home. Leave. Do it quietly. Do it now." Her throat tightened. She read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition could make it less real. The room felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if furniture had shifted while she wasn't looking. The house creaked and sighed the way it always did, but now each sound seemed to carry a meaning. Nadia pressed the note to her palm until the paper warmed, and she tried to hold on to the idea that she must be misunderstanding. Theo loved her. She had built his childhood with her hands. She had stayed up with fevers, attended every school meeting, worked extra shifts when money was tight, sold her jewelry once when he wanted to study abroad. He loved her. But love, she realized, could be performed. At 2 in the morning, she heard whispers in the kitchen. She moved without turning on lights, slipping her door open the smallest amount, and she followed the voices like a thread. Theo's tone was low and urgent. Mora's was sharper, impatient. Lila's had the lazy cruelty of someone who had never needed to earn her comfort. He wouldn't sign, Mora hissed. I gave him everything. I told him she's confused, that she forgets the stove, that she wanders. He still said she's fine. We'll find another doctor, Theo replied. Someone who understands the situation. And if she refuses? Lila asked. I can't wait forever. I need money for school. I need my life. Theo made a sound that should have been a protest but wasn't. We can make it easier for her to agree. Less comfort. Less attention. We'll tell her it's for her safety. Mora laughed softly. Or we make her look unstable. Switch her pills. Hide her things. Convince her she imagined conversations. After a month of that, any professional will see what we want them to see. Nadia stood in the dark hallway, her heart thudding so hard she feared it would betray her. The words landed inside her like stones. Switch her pills. Hide her things. Make her look unstable. Not just theft. Erasure. They wanted to take her mind, because a mindless woman couldn't defend what was hers. They spoke next about practicalities. Cards to copy, documents to adjust, a lawyer to consult about guardianship. They spoke about her house the way people speak about an object they plan to sell. They spoke about her as a problem. Nadia returned to her room and sat until dawn without sleeping, her hands quiet while her thoughts screamed. Grief arrived first, hot and disorienting. Then anger followed, steadier, colder, and far more useful. If she stayed, they would grind her down and call it care. If she confronted them, they would smile, deny, and begin the story that she was confused. She needed proof. She needed distance. She needed control. At 5, she packed a small suitcase. Documents, medications, a change of clothes, and a thin notebook she kept hidden under a false bottom in a drawer. In it were numbers and names and addresses written in her own careful hand, details she had never shared, not even with Theo. When her husband died, he had left her more than memories and a ring. He had left a safety net he'd built quietly. Money set aside beyond the view of neighbors, family, and anyone who believed kindness meant weakness. Nadia had kept it secret for one reason that now stung her with irony. She wanted Theo to love her without measuring her worth in dollars. Before she left, she started a voice recorder on her phone, walked softly past the kitchen, and captured more than enough. Theo speaking about guardianship, Mara speaking about forged letters, Lila speaking about how easy it would be if Nadia were out of the way. Nadia returned to her room, wrote a harmless note, gone to run errands. Back later. And placed it where they would see it and feel in control. Then she walked out of the house as if it were just another morning. She went first to the bank and withdrew enough cash to move freely without asking permission from a card that could be cancelled. The teller hesitated at the amount, but Nadia's gaze held steady. After that she chose a hotel in a part of the city where people valued privacy and didn't ask personal questions. The room was high enough to feel removed from the street, and quiet enough to hear herself think. When the door shut behind her, Nadia let the tears come, brief, fierce, cleansing. She cried for the decades she had poured into a family that had been practicing for this betrayal longer than she wanted to believe. Then she washed her face, sat at the desk, and began writing a plan in the notebook. Secure finances. Find legal counsel. Document everything. Protect identity. Lock down property. She wrote like a woman assembling a weapon from pieces she already owned. Theo called first, his voice tight with a false concern that she now recognized as panic. Where are you? Are you taking your medication? You don't sound like yourself. Nadia answered calmly, then ended the call and turned the phone off. Each question he asked was a brick in the story he planned to build. A story where she was unstable, irresponsible, and dangerous to herself. He wanted to define her reality. Nadia decided she would define it first. That afternoon she met an attorney recommended by a hotel concierge who had learned to distinguish between rich people's drama and real danger. The lawyer, Imran Vale, listened without interruption while Nadia played the recordings. His expression hardened into something that looked like respect. This is elder abuse, he said simply. And conspiracy. And fraud. And if they've touched your accounts, identity theft. We can protect you and we can prosecute them. Nadia folded her hands. I don't want a quiet settlement, she said. I want them stopped. I want them exposed. And I want my life back. Imran nodded as if he'd been waiting for her to say it. Then we start with safety, and we build pressure. We document, we freeze access, we file the right motions, and we let them make mistakes. People who think they own someone else always get sloppy when they feel control slipping. That night, Nadia turned her phone on and watched messages pile up. We're worried, please answer. Come home, you're scaring us, we might call the police. She replied once, I'm safe. I'll contact you through my attorney. And then she slept the first deep sleep she'd had in weeks, because the lock on the hotel door was hers alone. Imran moved fast. Within days, a private investigator traced spending patterns that made Nadia's stomach turn. Credit accounts opened in her name, purchases she had never made, balances she never authorized. Theo's employment story unraveled too. He had been jobless for months, living off a pension while acting like he was carrying the household. Mara had listed antiques online. Lila had told friends her grandmother was declining, using the story to borrow money with a bright smile and practiced sympathy. Each fact was a new bruise. Nadia had thought betrayal would feel like a single blow. Instead, it was a long, careful peeling away of illusion, layer by layer. And beneath it was a woman who had survived childbirth scares, wars on television, funeral flowers, and years of quiet sacrifice. She wasn't fragile. She had simply been kind. Imran advised her to do one thing that felt strange and wonderful: take up space. Nadia bought clothes that fit the person she was becoming, not the background figure she'd trained herself to be. She cut her hair. She sat in public restaurants. She walked through the city like she belonged to herself. It wasn't vanity. It was reclamation. When Theo called again and tried the word erratic, Nadia heard the trap in the syllables. She responded sweetly, asked him to explain what he meant, and recorded his attempt to suggest specialists. Every time he reached for the narrative that she was unstable, she collected it like evidence. Theo didn't realize he was helping her. He still thought she was trapped in old habits. Apologize, comply, return home. He didn't understand that the moment she read that doctor's note, she became someone else. The confrontation came not in the family living room, where they controlled the setting, but in a place that required truth, a real estate office. Nadia arrived first, dressed neatly, and met with an agent about purchasing a smaller house with better security. Then, at the time her investigator predicted, Theo, Mara, and Lila entered the lobby and began describing Nadia's home as if it were already theirs to sell. They used words like power of attorney, and she's confused, and we're just trying to do what's best. Nadia stepped into view and greeted them loudly, politely, and with the calm of a woman holding the match over a barrel of lies. Their faces did what their voices couldn't, betrayed them. Theo tried to talk her down, to pull her toward a private corner. Nadia refused. She asked, in front of witnesses, to see the documents that gave them authority. They had none. When Mara tried to claim Nadia wasn't right in the head, Nadia smiled and pointed to the fact that she was shopping for property with her own money while standing upright, coherent, and composed. It was the simplest kind of truth. Visible. Imran's associates arrived quickly, along with a notary to document the encounter. Theo stammered. Mara cried. Lila looked furious in the way young people look when the world refuses to hand them what they want. Nadia played a recording, Theo's own voice describing how they would make her look unstable. The air in the lobby changed as if oxygen had been replaced with judgment. Afterward, in the street, Mara's mask slipped completely. She spat insults that revealed the ugly heart of it, that Nadia chose to adopt Theo, that no one asked for sacrifice, that therefore Nadia owed them her assets. Theo begged. Lila pleaded. Nadia entered a taxi and left them on the curb with their performance collapsing in daylight. Within a week, their desperation made them reckless. They sought forged medical documents, and they paid for them with money they didn't have, using accounts in Nadia's name. The forger, however, was already on law enforcement's radar. The transaction became another piece of evidence, another trap they walked into willingly because they believed Nadia was too old to fight. Nadia could have stayed quiet and let the courts move at their slow, grinding pace. But silence had been her cage for years, and she had no intention of returning to it. She opened a live stream account under her own name and told her story as a warning and a lantern. She spoke plainly, played short clips of recordings, and explained the pattern, the way abusers dress greed in the language of care. The audience grew faster than she expected. People recognized the shape of the story, because it wasn't rare, it was simply hidden. Theo called midstream, furious, threatening lawsuits. Nadia asked him to repeat himself for the viewers. His voice faltered. Lila called next, crying about humiliation. Nadia listened, then answered with the quiet cruelty of truth. Humiliation was not the worst thing they had planned for her. Being stripped of her autonomy, her money, her mind, that was what they had tried to arrange. When the legal case reached court, it moved faster than Nadia imagined, pushed along by overwhelming documentation and the public attention that made backroom deals harder. Theo and Mara tried to paint Nadia as unstable. Imran brought independent evaluations, financial records, recordings, witness testimony, and evidence of identity theft. Lila, frightened and cornered by her own parents' willingness to sacrifice her, turned witness for the prosecution, admitting what she knew and handing over messages and videos that proved intent. The jury listened to the recordings where they spoke casually about switching medication. They listened to Theo describe guardianship not as protection but as a tool. They saw receipts, forged applications, and attempts to sell property without authority. And when Nadia took the stand, she did not perform grief. She described the betrayal plainly. Not melodrama, not vengeance, but clarity. The verdict came quickly. The sentences were severe enough to make the courtroom go still. Theo stared ahead like a man watching a door close that he thought was his to open. Mara cried, not for Nadia, but for herself. Lila looked exhausted, and Nadia felt a complicated ache for the granddaughter who had been shaped by two people who treated love like leverage. 6 months later, Nadia lived in a smaller home filled with light and locked doors that she controlled. She planted a garden the way some people build a new language. Slowly, intentionally, with patience. She created legal documents that protected her autonomy. She funded programs that educated older people about financial safety and coercion. She didn't become a hard person. She became a wise one. On quiet afternoons, when Lila studied across the table, Nadia sometimes remembered the old house and the woman who used to apologize for taking up space. That woman hadn't been foolish, Nadia realized. She had been generous. The difference now was that generosity had boundaries. And every night before sleep, she thought of the doctor who had risked his own comfort to warn her. She thought of the moment she chose to believe the note. She thought of the first step out the front door with a suitcase and a recorder and a spine that had been there all along. She didn't call it revenge anymore. She called it a return, back to herself, back to truth, back to the simple right to live her own life without asking permission from people who never deserved it. Nadia didn't leave the hotel suite for most of the next morning, not because she was afraid of the city, but because she finally understood the shape of the trap that had been closing around her for months and she needed silence to see the seams. The suite was quiet in the way expensive places are quiet. Thick carpet swallowing footsteps, heavy curtains muting traffic, a hum of distant elevators like a faraway tide, and for the first time in years the quiet belonged to her instead of being something she was forced to accept. She laid the doctor's note on the desk like evidence in a trial, then set her phone beside it, then opened her little notebook and stared at the lines of numbers she had protected like a second heartbeat. A part of her wanted to call Theo immediately, to demand an explanation, to plead for the son she had believed she raised. But another part, the part that had stayed awake through her husband's final nights and learned the discipline of endurance, knew that pleading only teaches predators where your softest places are. She made herself drink water, made herself eat a piece of toast, and then she began doing what she had always done in crisis. She organized. She wrote down every fact she had, and every fact she needed, and every action that could not wait. First, lock down identity and accounts so no one could open new credit lines. Second, confirm exactly what access Theo and Mara had to her day-to-day finances. Third, place her home and assets under legal protection before they forged anything that would confuse a bank clerk or a court clerk long enough for damage to be done. Fourth, find out how far they'd already gone, because the note told her what they planned, but the tone of their midnight conversation told her something worse. They had been rehearsing. When she turned her phone on, the screen filled instantly, like a dam breaking. Missed calls stacking in red numbers, voicemails, texts arriving so fast the notification sound became a frantic chirp. Theo's messages came in waves, swinging from honey to steel. "Mom, please answer, I'm worried." Became, "This isn't like you." Became, "You're scaring us." Became, "If you don't respond we have to protect you." The word protect sitting there like a hand over her mouth. Mora's messages were shorter and colder, as if she didn't want a record of emotion. "Where are you? Call me now. This is serious." Lila's texts were a strange mix of childish whining and adult menace. "Grandma, you're embarrassing us," followed by "Dad says you're having an episode," followed by, "If you don't come home they'll make you." Nadia felt an odd calm settle over her as she read, because each message was proof of what they were trying to build, the narrative. A normal family would say, "Are you safe? Do you need help? Can we bring you something?" Theo didn't ask that. He demanded location, demanded compliance, demanded reassurance, not that she was okay but that she was under their control. She let the phone sit, unlocked and buzzing, while she called the bank using the direct number on her card instead of any number that could be spoofed or redirected. She asked to speak to the manager, not a teller, and when the manager came on, Nadia kept her voice steady and polite, because politeness makes professionals listen. She explained that she suspected attempted fraud and identity theft and wanted extra security placed on her accounts. She requested verbal passwords, notes on the file, and a requirement that any significant changes be approved in person with identification. The manager's tone shifted at the word suspected fraud. The world, Nadia realized, still moved for people who spoke in the language of liability. When she hung up, she felt a small, solid click inside her chest, like the first bolt sliding into place. Next she called the credit bureaus and initiated freezes, listening to automated menus with the patience of someone who had survived long hospital waiting rooms, then confirming each step and writing down confirmation numbers in her notebook. Every time she wrote a number, she felt herself becoming less like a frightened woman in flight and more like a commander assembling defenses. Around noon, she met Imran Vale in the hotel's business lounge, a glass and wood room that smelled faintly of coffee and money. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who performed empathy like a salesperson. He had attentive eyes and a voice that didn't waste words, and Nadia found she trusted him more for that. He asked her to tell the story from the beginning, and as she spoke she realized how many small humiliations she had accepted over the past year without naming them as humiliations. Theo forgetting to tell her about household expenses while somehow always knowing her pension deposit dates, Mara helping by sorting mail and then not handing her statements unless Nadia asked, Lila rolling her eyes when Nadia asked about school, as if curiosity itself were an offense. She described the doctor's note, the midnight conversation, the plans to switch medication, the power of guardianship wielded like a club, and Imran nodded, occasionally asking a question so precise it felt like a scalpel. "Do they have copies of your identification?" Who is listed as beneficiary on your accounts? Are there any joint accounts? Do they have access to your email? Nadia answered as best she could, feeling a dull shame at how many details she didn't know about her own life because she had assumed love made vigilance unnecessary. Imran's assistant brought in forms, and Nadia signed authorizations that allowed the firm to request records and communicate with institutions on her behalf. It felt strange, delegating power outward when she had spent decades giving power inward to her family, but Imran explained it in a way that made it feel less like surrender and more like strategy. We create a professional wall, he said. Anything they say to you becomes noise. Anything they say to us becomes evidence. He recommended a protective order and also suggested Nadia undergo an independent cognitive evaluation immediately. Not because she doubted herself, but because courts and banks love paperwork more than truth, and the best way to cut off a lie is to stab it with official language. Nadia agreed, and within hours she was sitting in a calm office with a clinical psychologist who asked her questions about dates, words, patterns, memories. Nadia answered easily, almost amused by how insultingly simple some were, and when the psychologist smiled and told her she was sharp as a tack, Nadia felt something close to vindication, not because she needed permission to be sane, but because she understood now how sanity could be stolen by narrative if you didn't lock it down with proof. Imran arranged a private investigator named Salma Riaz, a woman with steady hands and an unromantic approach to truth. Salma met Nadia briefly, asked for photos of Theo, Mara, and Lila, asked for addresses and routines, and then said, if they're already planning guardianship, they're already doing financial groundwork. People don't start with the court, they start with the money. By evening, Nadia returned to her suite with a folder of documents and a strange exhaustion that came from doing hard work while holding heartbreak at bay. She tried to sleep, but her mind kept replaying the kitchen voices, especially Theo's, the voice she had once heard reading bedtime stories, now coldly planning how to make her question her own reality. Around midnight she sat up and stared at the city lights beyond the window, thinking about the secret she had kept for a decade, the inheritance her husband had arranged in quiet caution, and she felt anger twist with grief. She had hidden that money not out of greed but out of hope, the hope that Theo would be proud of building his own life rather than waiting to consume hers. Now she saw that hope as a kind of blindness. Not because people never deserve trust, but because she had used trust as an excuse not to look closely, and looking closely was what she should have done the moment her husband died and the household shifted. In the morning, Salma called with the first slice of truth. Mrs. Harrow, she said, they've been using your identity. Nadia's stomach tightened. Salma explained, precise and calm, that multiple credit accounts had been opened within the last 6 months using Nadia's information. Her name, her address, her date of birth. The spending wasn't small. Designer purchases, high-end electronics, hotel charges in places Nadia had never visited. One of the charges is a vacation rental, Salma continued. They told you they were visiting Mara's mother? Nadia remembered, suddenly, Mara crying dramatically at the kitchen counter, Theo offering sympathetic murmurs, Lila sighing like the world was a burden, and Nadia pressing bills into Theo's hand because grief stories make kind people generous. Yes, Nadia whispered. They said her mother was ill. Her mother wasn't, Salma said. At least not enough to explain a beachfront rental and restaurant spending every night. Nadia gripped the edge of the desk until her knuckles whitened. The betrayal had layers, not just planning to steal, but practicing it. Not just lying, but weaving lies into the moments Nadia had thought were family emergencies. Salma went on. Theo hasn't been employed for months. He's been drawing money from accounts connected to you. Small transfers, regular withdrawals. And he's contacted multiple clinics in the last few weeks asking about assessments for dementia. Nadia closed her eyes. When she opened them, the room looked the same but felt different, as if she had moved one step farther away from her old life and could now see it as a whole structure rather than a series of days. And Lila? She asked, hating how her voice softened when she spoke of her granddaughter. Salma hesitated, then said, she's been telling people you're declining. She's been using it to borrow money, saying it's for your care. Nadia let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. The cruelty of it was not just theft but theater. They were rehearsing the public sympathy they would need to cover their greed. By midday, Imran's office had drafted formal notices to banks, credit issuers, and relevant agencies. Nadia signed more papers, each signature like a small reclaiming of authorship. Imran explained they would send cease and desist letters, file for immediate protective measures, and prepare a criminal complaint if the evidence supported it, and it did. Nadia listened, and underneath the shock and rage, another feeling began to bloom, unfamiliar and fierce: relief. Not the relief of escaping danger, but the relief of no longer pretending. She had spent years smoothing over little cuts: Theo's impatience, Mara's contempt disguised as helpfulness, Lila's coldness hidden under teenage attitude. She had told herself families were complicated, that love required patience, that she should be grateful she wasn't alone. Now she saw the truth. She had been lonely inside company, and that kind of loneliness is the worst because it convinces you don't deserve better. That afternoon, Nadia did something that surprised even her. She walked into a clothing store and bought a dress that was not practical and not age-appropriate by the rules she had swallowed for decades. It was simple and elegant, something that fit her body as it was rather than apologizing for it, and when she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a fragile grandmother. She saw a woman with a straight spine, a woman with eyes that had learned to measure risk, a woman who had survived too much to be bullied by her own household. Later, in the salon chair, as a stylist brushed out her hair, the young woman asked why Nadia hadn't treated herself like this before. Nadia almost answered with a joke, but honesty rose instead. Because I spent a long time believing my purpose was to make everyone else comfortable, she said. The stylist's hands paused, then continued more gently. And now? She asked. Nadia looked at her reflection, at the sharper cut taking shape, at the light returning to her face in small, deliberate strokes. Now, Nadia said, my purpose is to keep myself safe. That evening Theo called again, and Nadia let it ring once, twice, then answered and pressed the record button with a calm that felt like stepping onto solid ground. Theo's voice arrived breathless, as if he'd been sprinting toward control. Mom, where are you? This is not okay, he demanded. Nadia listened without interrupting, letting him pile urgency onto the line. When he paused, she spoke softly. Theo, I'm safe, she said. And I'm making arrangements. Arrangements for what? You can't just disappear. Mara is terrified. Lila can't sleep. Nadia almost laughed at the performance. Is Mara terrified, she asked, or is she angry? Mom, don't do this, Theo snapped. You're acting strange. There it was, the word he wanted. The first stone in the road toward incompetence. Nadia kept her voice even. Strange because I'm not telling you my location, she asked. Strange because I'm not asking permission to exist. Theo's breathing tightened. Mom, you're 70. You forget things. You get confused sometimes. You left your keys in the fridge last month. Nadia remembered that moment. Mara laughing too loudly, Theo smiling thinly, Lila filming it on her phone like a joke. Nadia had laughed along, embarrassed, because that's what kind people do. They turn humiliation into humor to spare others discomfort. Now she heard it as proof of their long-term story building. People misplace things, Nadia said. That doesn't make them incompetent. We just want what's best for you, Theo insisted, and the phrase landed like a slap because she now knew what he meant. What's best for us? Nadia let a beat pass so the recorder could catch the exact shape of his manipulation. Theo, she said finally, I know you went to my doctor. Silence. Not full silence because the line still carried breath, but the kind of silence that happens when someone realizes the room has changed. What are you talking about? Theo said, but his voice had shifted, losing the easy authority. I know you asked him to certify me, Nadia said. I know you asked about my assets. And I know you've been planning guardianship. Theo tried to recover. Mom, you're imagining things. Am I? Nadia asked, softly, dangerously. Because I heard you last night, Theo. I heard you talking about switching my medication to make me look unstable. Theo's denial came too fast. That's insane. Who told you that? Nadia smiled, though he couldn't see it. The truth told me, she said. And also my own ears. Theo's voice rose. Mom, you need help. This is paranoia. Nadia let him say it. Let him build the evidence of his intent. Then she spoke with a calm that startled even her. I'm getting help, she said. Legal help. You can't do that to us, Theo snapped, and the words were so honest they almost sounded like a confession. To us, Nadia repeated. Not to you. To all of you. That's interesting. Theo stammered, then tried a new angle, softer. Mom, come home. We'll talk. We'll sort this out. Nadia pictured the house, the kitchen, the hallway where she had leaned against the wall trembling while they laughed about destroying her mind. No, she said. I won't be alone with you again. Theo's voice hardened into threat. If you don't come back, we'll have to take steps, he said. We can petition the court. We can protect you from yourself. Nadia felt the last thread of old guilt snap. You can try, she said. And when you do, you'll be doing it with my attorney watching. Theo cursed under his breath. Nadia ended the call and exhaled slowly, realizing her hands were steady. She had expected fear to make her tremble. Instead, truth had made her solid. She spent the rest of the night with Imran's documents spread out like maps, signing, initialing, reading every line, asking questions she never would have asked before. It was strange, becoming her own advocate at 70, but also strangely natural, as if she had been holding her breath for decades and now her lungs were remembering what air felt like. At dawn, Salma's next report arrived, and it contained a detail that turned Nadia's determination into something sharper. Theo and Mara had been meeting someone described as a fixer, a man known for arranging paperwork that shouldn't exist. The name meant nothing to Nadia, but the implication did. Forged documents could confuse timelines, shift assets, and muddy water. They're accelerating, Salma said. They think you'll be easier to catch if they move fast. Nadia stared at the city waking beyond her window and felt a cold clarity settle in. If her family wanted to make her disappear into a facility and rewrite her story as dementia, then she would do the opposite. She would make herself visible, documented, undeniable. She opened her notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of a clean page, the way a general writes an order. They will not define me. Then she wrote the next line beneath it, even simpler and far more powerful. I will. Nadia understood that visibility was now both her shield and her sword, and once that understanding settled, fear lost much of its power. The morning after Salma warned her about the fixer, Nadia moved through her day with the deliberate calm of someone who knows the next steps matter more than the noise around them. She dressed carefully, not for vanity but for clarity, choosing clothes that made her feel unmistakably herself, then sat with Imran in his office while the city buzzed outside, oblivious to how one woman's private war was tightening into something larger. Imran explained that the speed of her family's actions worked in her favor. Desperate people made mistakes, and those mistakes left fingerprints. They reviewed the evidence again, this time not as a catalogue of wrongs but as a timeline, mapping intent to action to consequence. Nadia watched the story of her own betrayal take shape on paper, and something inside her hardened into resolve. This was no longer about reclaiming money or reputation alone. It was about reclaiming authorship of her life. When Imran suggested that they allow Theo and Mara to formally file for guardianship if they chose to, Nadia surprised herself by agreeing. Let them, she said. I want the court to see exactly what they're trying to do. It felt counterintuitive, stepping into a trap on purpose, but she trusted Imran's reasoning. False claims collapse fastest under scrutiny, especially when countered with clean evaluations and documented abuse. The key, he said, was to stay ahead of the narrative, to file first where possible, to be the voice the court heard before the whispering reached its ears. That afternoon, Nadia underwent a second evaluation, this one arranged by Imran, with a specialist known for meticulous reporting. The questions were more nuanced, the conversation longer, probing not just memory but judgment, insight, emotional regulation. Nadia answered. Honestly, even when the questions brushed against her pain. She spoke about discovering her family's plans, about the shock and anger, about the clarity that followed. The doctor listened, nodding, occasionally asking her to expand on a thought. When it was over, he thanked her for her candor and told her something that lingered with her long after she left the office. You're not confused, he said. You're responding appropriately to betrayal. That's not pathology, that's reality. Those words felt like a bomb. Nadia realized how often older people were expected to respond to harm with gratitude, to smile through injustice, and how quickly strong emotion was mislabeled as instability when it inconvenienced others. She returned to the hotel with a copy of the preliminary report and a renewed sense of purpose. Salma's next update arrived by secure message late that night. Theo had gone to Nadia's bank branch in person, claiming an emergency, insisting his mother was not herself and needed him to manage her affairs temporarily. The bank manager, already alerted by Imran's notices, had refused him and documented the encounter. Mara, meanwhile, had attempted to sell several pieces of Nadia's jewelry, claiming they were gifts, but had been turned away when she couldn't produce proof of ownership. Nadia read the message twice, feeling a strange mix of fury and vindication. They were escalating exactly as Salma predicted, and every escalation was being recorded. The thought that strangers now knew what her family was doing brought a sting of embarrassment, but it was quickly overtaken by relief. Shame thrives in secrecy. Exposure starves it. The next morning, Nadia woke to dozens of new messages, not from her family, but from people who had somehow learned pieces of her story. Word traveled fast in quiet neighborhoods, and even faster when bank employees and clinic staff recognized patterns they'd seen before. Some messages were tentative, offering help if she needed it. Others were blunt, warning her to stay away from her house, telling her they'd seen Theo pacing the yard late at night, Mara loading boxes into the car. Nadia forwarded everything to Salma, who confirmed what Nadia already sensed. Her home was no longer safe. It wasn't just the risk of confrontation, it was the risk of evidence disappearing. Nadia authorized Salma to document everything, to photograph listings, to record movements, to preserve proof before it vanished into plausible deniability. Each authorization felt like another door closing behind her old life, but she no longer mourned the sound. That evening, Theo left a voicemail that made Nadia's stomach knot. His voice was trembling, a mix of anger and something like fear. He accused her of abandonment, of cruelty, of humiliating the family by involving lawyers. He claimed Mara was sick with worry, that Lila was falling apart, that Nadia was destroying everything. Nadia listened without interruption, then replayed it once more, focusing not on the accusations but on what they revealed. Theo didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't apologize. He centered his own discomfort, his own loss of control. When the message ended, Nadia saved it to the growing archive and sat quietly, breathing through the ache. She allowed herself a few minutes of grief, the kind that comes not from surprise but from confirmation. The son she had loved was not lost because of this conflict. He had been gone long before, replaced by someone who saw her as a resource to be managed. Imran suggested a step that initially unsettled her, making her situation public, not through gossip or half-truths, but through her own voice. Nadia recoiled at first, imagining judgment, misunderstanding, the cruelty of strangers. But as Imran explained the strategy, she saw its logic. If her family was already spreading a story of her decline, she needed to counter it with clarity, evidence, and presence. Silence would allow their narrative to grow unchecked. Speech would anchor hers in reality. Nadia spent a long night considering it, weighing dignity against necessity, privacy against protection. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would speak, but she would do it on her terms, without melodrama, without embellishment, and without naming details that could be twisted. She would tell the truth as a warning, not as a spectacle. Setting up the live stream account felt surreal, like stepping onto a stage she had never wanted. Nadia chose a simple background, neutral light, nothing that suggested frailty or excess. She wrote a brief outline on a notepad, not a script, just reminders to breathe, to pause, to stick to facts. When she went live, the first few minutes were quiet, the viewer count barely ticking upward. Nadia introduced herself calmly, stated her age, and said she was speaking because she had learned that silence could be dangerous when people were trying to erase you. She described the doctor's note, the plans she overheard, the steps she took to protect herself. She did not name her family. She did not insult them. She spoke as if she were testifying, because in a way, she was. As the viewer count climbed, comments began to appear, many from people who recognized the pattern instantly. They shared their own stories in fragments, thanking her for saying out loud what they had been taught to doubt. Nadia felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, not pride but connection. She wasn't alone in this after all. Halfway through the stream, her phone lit up with an incoming call from Lila. Nadia hesitated, then answered, putting it on speaker so the exchange was transparent. Lila's voice was sharp with panic. She begged Nadia to stop, to think about the family's reputation, to consider how humiliating this was. Nadia listened, then asked a single question that cut through the pleading. Were you going to consider my dignity when you planned to take my autonomy? Lila fell silent, then muttered something about options and misunderstandings. Nadia thanked her for calling, ended the call gently, and addressed the viewers again, explaining that emotional pressure was often the last tool people reached for when facts failed them. When the stream ended, Nadia felt drained but steady, as if she had set something heavy down at last. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers offering support, advice, legal resources. Some were older women who had been through similar battles. Others were professionals thanking her for articulating a problem they saw daily but rarely addressed publicly. Nadia forwarded relevant offers to Imran and Salma, careful not to engage directly beyond brief thanks. She knew that visibility came with risks, and she intended to manage those risks deliberately. The next morning, news outlets began calling, but Imran advised caution. We control the pace, he said. We don't let this turn into entertainment. Nadia agreed. She would speak again, but only when it served the goal of protection and justice. Meanwhile, her family unraveled. Salma reported that Theo and Mara were arguing loudly, neighbors overhearing accusations, blame shifting rapidly. Lila had stopped going to school, telling friends her grandmother was ruining her life. Theo had contacted a lawyer who specialized in guardianship, but when faced with Nadia's evaluations and documentation, the lawyer had declined the case. Each rejection seemed to push Theo and Mara closer to reckless decisions. Salma warned that they might attempt to fabricate documents soon, driven by the belief that paperwork could outrun truth if produced quickly enough. Nadia authorized Salma to coordinate with authorities quietly, ensuring that any interaction with known forgers would be monitored. It felt strange, becoming part of a system she had always trusted abstractly but never engaged personally, yet Nadia found comfort in the structure. Systems, unlike families, were bound by rules. One evening, as Nadia reviewed the latest updates, she received an unexpected message from a woman named Ruth, a retired nurse who lived a few streets away from Nadia's old house. Ruth wrote simply that she had noticed Mara removing boxes late at night and had taken photos, unsure at first whether it was appropriate, but now believing it might matter. Nadia stared at the message, heart pounding, then thanked Ruth and connected her with Salma. The photos turned out to show Mara loading what appeared to be Nadia's antique furniture into a rented van. The timestamps were clear. Nadia felt a surge of anger so sharp it surprised her, followed immediately by a sense of grim satisfaction. The evidence was undeniable now. They weren't just planning, they were executing. Imran moved swiftly. He filed for an emergency injunction to prevent the sale or transfer of Nadia's property and belongings, citing imminent risk of irreparable harm. The court granted it within hours. Salma coordinated with local authorities to ensure the order was served promptly. Nadia imagined the moment Theo and Mara received the papers, the shock, the outrage, the sudden realization that the world was no longer bending around them. She didn't savor the thought, but she didn't shy away from it either. Consequences, she realized, were not cruelty, they were boundaries enforced. That night, Nadia sat alone in her suite, the city lights flickering like distant stars, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The grief returned, softer but deeper, mourning not just the family she had lost but the years she had spent shrinking herself to keep peace. She thought of her husband, of the quiet precautions he had taken, of how he had once told her, "Love is generous, but it should never be blind." She wished she had understood that sooner. Yet she also knew regret could become another trap, a way of punishing herself for trusting. Instead, she chose gratitude, for the doctor who warned her, for the professionals who believed her, for the strangers who stood up when they saw injustice. Before going to bed, Nadia wrote again in her notebook, adding to the sentence she had started days earlier. "Beneath I will define myself," she wrote. "I will not disappear quietly." The words felt like a promise, not just to herself but to everyone watching, listening, and gathering courage from her refusal to be erased. Part 3 of her journey closed not with resolution, but with momentum, the kind that comes when truth and preparation finally move in the same direction, unstoppable and clear. By the time Nadia realized that momentum had its own gravity, she also understood that gravity could be guided if you learned how to lean into it rather than fight it. The days following her live stream blurred together in a strange rhythm of waiting and action, silence and sudden noise, as if her life had been placed inside a tide pool where calm water could erupt without warning. Imran's office became the axis around which everything turned. Each morning began with a briefing, not unlike a military update, except the battlefield was made of bank statements, recorded calls, timestamps, and sworn declarations. Nadia listened, asked questions, and signed where needed, but she no longer felt like a passenger. She felt like a participant who had finally been handed the map. Imran explained that the injunction had effectively frozen Theo and Mara's ability to touch anything of hers without immediate legal consequences, and that this would force them to choose between retreat and escalation. Nadia suspected she knew which one they would pick. People who believed themselves entitled rarely stepped back when challenged. They lunged, convinced that force would restore order. She was right. Within 48 hours, Theo filed a petition for emergency guardianship, alleging cognitive decline, emotional instability, and reckless behavior. The language was almost insulting in its familiarity, echoing phrases Nadia had already heard him rehearse on the phone. What surprised her was not the filing itself, but the speed. It was as if Theo believed that repetition could turn lies into facts, that sheer insistence could overpower evidence. Imran read the petition aloud, his tone neutral, and Nadia felt a flicker of something like amusement cut through her anger. Theo had underestimated how visible he had become. The guardianship hearing was scheduled quickly, as such hearings often were, driven by the court's desire to protect vulnerable adults. Nadia appreciated the irony. The very mechanism Theo sought to use against her would now expose him to scrutiny he could not control. Imran prepared her carefully, not just legally but psychologically. "They'll try to provoke you," he warned. "They'll want you emotional, defensive, anything that can be twisted into instability. Your job is not to persuade them. It's to be unmistakably yourself." Nadia nodded, absorbing the advice. She had spent a lifetime smoothing her reactions for others. Now she practiced stillness for herself. The night before the hearing, she slept poorly, not from fear but from the restless energy of someone standing on the edge of something irreversible. When morning came, she dressed in a simple suit, neither severe nor soft, and pinned a small brooch her husband had given her years ago. It wasn't superstition. It was grounding. It reminded her who she had been before she allowed herself to be reduced to a role. The courtroom was smaller than Nadia expected, intimate enough that every breath felt amplified. Theo sat at one table with Mara and their attorney, his jaw tight, his posture rigid with performative concern. Mara clutched a folder and dabbed at her eyes with practiced delicacy, already playing her part. Nadia sat with Imran, calm hands folded, her posture relaxed but attentive. When the judge entered, Nadia rose with everyone else, feeling the room's attention settle like a weight. The proceedings began with Theo's attorney outlining the alleged decline, painting Nadia as confused, impulsive, and manipulated by outsiders. He spoke smoothly, confidently, and for a moment Nadia felt the old reflex to shrink, to apologize for existing in a way that inconvenienced others. She crushed that impulse deliberately. When it was Imran's turn, he didn't raise his voice or attack their claims directly. Instead, he laid out a sequence of facts, supported by documents, evaluations, and timelines. He introduced the independent cognitive assessments, the recorded calls, the bank manager's affidavit, the photographs of Mara removing property, the injunction already granted due to imminent risk. He let the evidence speak, each piece clicking into place like a mechanism designed to reveal truth through alignment rather than argument. Nadia watched the judge's expression shift incrementally, skepticism giving way to concern, concern to clarity. When Nadia was asked to speak, she stood slowly, meeting the judge's gaze without defiance or fear. She described her life plainly, her relationship with Theo, the trust she had placed in her family, and the moment that trust shattered. She spoke of the doctor's note, the conversation she overheard, the steps she took to protect herself. She did not exaggerate. She did not editorialize. She told the story as one might recount a storm that had passed through their house, devastating but observable. When Theo's attorney attempted to interrupt, suggesting that Nadia's calmness itself was rehearsed, the judge raised a hand, silencing him. Nadia finished, her voice steady, and returned to her seat. The judge ruled swiftly, denying the guardianship petition, citing lack of evidence and credible indications of abuse. She warned Theo and Mara that further attempts to assert control over Nadia's affairs without proper cause would be viewed unfavorably by the court. As the gavel struck, Nadia felt a release she hadn't anticipated, a loosening in her chest that felt like oxygen flooding a space that had been sealed too long. She didn't look at Theo as she left. She didn't need to. The decision had spoken louder than any confrontation could. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, their questions sharp and eager. Imran shielded Nadia gently, guiding her past with a practiced hand. Nadia offered a brief statement, measured and calm, thanking the court and emphasizing the importance of protecting autonomy and dignity at every age. She declined to answer questions about her family. "This isn't about spectacle," she said. "It's about safety." The words were quoted later, and Nadia was glad for that. She wanted the focus to remain where it belonged. In the days that followed, the legal pressure intensified. With the guardianship denied and the injunction in place, Theo and Mara found themselves increasingly isolated. Financial institutions flagged their activities. The investigation into identity theft moved forward, bolstered by the volume and clarity of evidence. Law enforcement interviewed neighbors, bank employees, clinic staff. Each interview added weight to the case, narrowing the space Theo and Mara had to maneuver. Nadia stayed largely out of sight, by design, letting professionals do what they were trained to do. She spoke again via livestream only once, briefly, to update viewers and encourage anyone in similar situations to seek help and document everything. The response remained overwhelmingly supportive, but Nadia resisted the pull of attention. She understood now that power didn't require constant visibility. It required strategic presence. Then came the call from Solma that shifted everything. Theo and Mara, cornered and panicking, had contacted a man known for producing false documents, seeking to expedite a medical declaration of incompetence and a revised will. The man, however, was already cooperating with authorities. The meeting was recorded. Payments were traced. Nadia listened to Solma's report in stunned silence, a mix of horror and grim inevitability washing over her. She had known they might go this far, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch. "This escalates things significantly," Solma said. "It's no longer just civil. It's criminal." Nadia closed her eyes, absorbing the finality of that shift. There would be no quiet resolution now, no possibility of repairing what had broken. The line between family conflict and crime had been crossed decisively. When she told Imran, his response was calm but resolute. "Then we proceed accordingly," he said. "And we protect you." The arrest came sooner than Nadia expected. Law enforcement executed warrants, seizing devices, documents, and records. Theo and Mara were taken in for questioning. Nadia learned of it not through official channels but through a news alert that flashed across her phone while she was eating breakfast. For a moment, she simply stared at the screen, the words blurring. This was the culmination of everything that had been building for weeks, yet it didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, like the closing of a door that would never open again. Later that day, Imran confirmed the charges: conspiracy, fraud, identity theft, attempted coercion. Bail was set high. Nadia sat quietly after the call, the silence of her suite wrapping around her. She allowed herself to feel the grief fully this time, without pushing it away. She cried for the child Theo had been, for the future she had imagined, for the simple family gatherings that would never happen. And then, when the tears subsided, she felt something else settle in their place. Peace. Not happiness, not relief, but peace, the kind that comes from knowing you did not betray yourself. Lila reached out that evening, her message tentative, stripped of its earlier bravado. She asked to talk, just the two of them. Nadia hesitated. She knew Lila had been complicit, had benefited from the lies, but she also sensed that Lila was now facing the reality of her parents' choices. Nadia agreed to meet in a public place, with conditions. The meeting was awkward, painful, and honest. Lila admitted she had known more than she should have, that she had gone along with the plan because it felt easier than challenging her parents, because money and comfort had been dangled like inevitabilities. She cried when she spoke of the arrest, fear breaking through entitlement. Nadia listened, her heart aching, but she did not excuse what had been done. Choices matter, she said gently. And now you have to choose who you want to be when no one is promising you anything. Lila nodded, shaken. Nadia didn't offer forgiveness that night. She offered clarity. Forgiveness, she knew, was not something to be rushed, and certainly not something owed. As weeks passed, the case moved toward trial, and Nadia's life began to settle into a new pattern. She found a small house she liked, bright and manageable, and made an offer that was accepted. She packed her belongings with care, separating what she wanted to keep from what she was ready to let go. Each object felt like a conversation with her past, and she chose deliberately what would follow her into the future. She spent afternoons walking, reading, sitting in cafes where no one knew her story. Sometimes she caught herself smiling at nothing in particular, surprised by the lightness that crept in when vigilance eased. The battle wasn't over, but the worst of the uncertainty had passed. She knew where she stood. She knew who she was. Nadia's journey closed not with celebration, but with consolidation. The structures that had once trapped her were dismantled, replaced by safeguards she had chosen. The people who had sought to erase her were now answering to systems they could not manipulate. And Nadia, standing on the threshold of a life she had not planned but was ready to claim, understood that survival was not just about escaping harm. It was about rebuilding with intention, about learning to trust again without surrendering oneself, about recognizing that dignity, once reclaimed, could not be taken unless you handed it back. The trial arrived not with drama but with a quiet inevitability, the way winter arrives after you've already packed away the garden tools and accepted that the season has turned. Nadia felt this most keenly on the morning she walked into the courthouse for the first day of testimony. There were cameras outside again, reporters murmuring, but inside the building everything was restrained, procedural, bound by rules that did not care about family ties or personal history. Nadia appreciated that. Rules, she had learned, were not heartless. They were impartial, and impartiality was sometimes the only mercy available. She took her seat beside Imran, folded her hands, and breathed steadily while Theo and Mara were led in. They looked smaller than she remembered, worn down by weeks of consequences they had never believed would come. Theo avoided her gaze entirely. Mara glanced at her once, quickly, as if checking whether Nadia had become the villain she needed her to be. Nadia met that glance without anger. What she felt instead was distance, a clean separation that allowed her to observe without being pulled back into old patterns. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. There was no need for theatrical flourishes when the evidence spoke so clearly. The forged applications, the recorded meetings, the attempted sale of property, the guardianship petition denied on the basis of false claims, the intercepted communications with the document fixer, each piece was introduced, explained, and contextualized. Nadia listened as if the story belonged to someone else, occasionally startled by how calm she felt. This was not detachment. It was acceptance. The defense tried, as Imran had predicted, to paint Nadia as vindictive, as a wealthy older woman exaggerating misunderstandings into crimes. But every attempt collapsed under cross-examination. Documents contradicted claims. Timelines unraveled stories. When Theo took the stand, his answers were evasive, his explanations shifting. He spoke of stress, of fear for his mother, of miscommunication. The prosecutor played the recordings where Theo described switching medication, and the courtroom grew very still. Nadia watched Theo's face change as his own voice filled the room, heard the moment he realized there was no reframing that could undo what had been captured. Mora's testimony fared no better. She cried, she claimed manipulation, she insisted she had acted out of desperation. But desperation did not explain planning, and it certainly did not explain the lengths she had gone to secure documents that would strip Nadia of her autonomy. By the end of the third day, the air in the courtroom felt heavy with certainty. Lila's testimony came on the fourth day, and Nadia felt her breath catch despite herself. Lila looked younger than Nadia remembered, stripped of the confidence she had worn like armor. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she spoke. She admitted what she knew, what she had overheard, what she had been told to repeat. She admitted benefiting from the lies, from the borrowed money, from the assumption that her grandmother would never fight back. The defense attempted to discredit her, suggesting she was motivated by self-interest, by fear of being implicated. Lila did not deny fear. "I was afraid," she said. "But I'm more afraid of becoming someone who does nothing when something wrong is happening." Nadia felt a tear slip free then, not from sadness alone but from recognition. Lila was standing where Nadia herself had stood decades earlier, faced with a choice between comfort and integrity. The cycle, Nadia realized, could be broken, but only if someone was willing to absorb the cost of doing so. When it was Nadia's turn to testify, she approached the stand with a quiet dignity that surprised even her. She spoke of love and trust, of the gradual erosion of boundaries she had mistaken for family closeness. She described the moment she overheard the plan to dismantle her sanity, the terror of realizing that the people she loved saw her as an obstacle. She described leaving the house before dawn, not as an act of rebellion but as an act of survival. The prosecutor asked her how she felt now. Nadia considered the question carefully. "I feel clear," she said finally. "Clear about who I am, and clear about what I will no longer accept." The defense tried one last tactic, asking why Nadia had hidden part of her finances from her family, implying deceit. Nadia answered without defensiveness. "I hid nothing that belonged to them," she said. "I protected what belonged to me. Trust does not require surrender." The judge nodded slightly, a small gesture that carried weight. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all major counts. Sentencing followed weeks later, and Nadia attended, though she did not feel compelled to watch every moment. Theo received a sentence that reflected the severity of his actions and the breach of trust inherent in elder abuse. Mora's sentence followed, tempered only slightly by cooperation late in the process that came too late to undo the harm. When the judge spoke about accountability and deterrence, Nadia listened with a strange calm. This was not vengeance. It was an acknowledgement. As she left the courtroom for the last time, reporters shouted questions, but Nadia declined them with a gentle shake of her head. She had said what needed to be said already. Life after the trial unfolded slowly, deliberately. Nadia moved into her new home, a modest place with a garden that caught the afternoon sun. She unpacked in stages, allowing herself to pause over certain objects, letting others go without ceremony. She planted herbs, then flowers, then a small tree whose growth she looked forward to witnessing. Each morning she walked the neighborhood, learning the rhythms of a place that did not hold ghosts. She began volunteering with an organization that supported older adults navigating financial and familial abuse, not as a spokesperson but as a listener. She knew now that listening was often the first step toward empowerment. People told her their stories in fragments, testing whether she would believe them. Nadia always did. She had learned how easy it was for truth to be dismissed when it was inconvenient. Her relationship with Lyle evolved cautiously. There were boundaries, conversations that were difficult, silences that needed time. Nadia did not rush forgiveness, but she did not close the door entirely. Lyle enrolled in counseling, finished school, and began working part-time. Sometimes they had tea together in the garden, speaking of ordinary things. Other times they spoke of the past, carefully, honestly. Nadia did not try to rewrite history. She allowed it to exist, acknowledged, without letting it dominate the present. When Lyle thanked her one afternoon for not abandoning her completely, Nadia answered with the truth. "I didn't stay because of obligation," she said. "I stayed because I saw you trying to choose differently." Months passed. Nadia traveled, something she had postponed for years out of habit rather than necessity. She visited places she had only seen in books, walked streets where no one knew her story, and felt a lightness she had not expected to find at her age. She made new friends, people who met her as she was now rather than as a role she had filled. At night, she slept deeply, untroubled by whispers or footsteps in the hallway. The fear that had once lived in her body like a constant hum faded into memory. On the anniversary of the day she had left her old house, Nadia sat in her garden with a notebook, the same one she had used to plan her escape. She flipped through the pages, past the lists and numbers and notes that had once felt like lifelines. On the final page, she wrote slowly, deliberately, not as a declaration but as a reflection. She wrote about kindness, about how it was not a weakness but a resource that needed protection. She wrote about family, about how shared blood did not guarantee shared values, and how chosen bonds could be just as strong. She wrote about age, about how growing older did not mean growing smaller, and how wisdom was often the willingness to say no when no was required. When she finished, she closed the notebook and placed it on a shelf, not hidden this time, but visible, because she no longer needed to guard herself through secrecy. Nadia's story did not end with applause or universal understanding. Some people still whispered, still questioned, still preferred simpler narratives where families were either wholly good or wholly bad. Nadia let those whispers pass. She had learned that peace did not come from being believed by everyone. It came from believing herself. As she tended her garden, as she planned her next trip, as she supported others finding their footing, she felt a quiet pride, not in having survived something terrible, but in having chosen herself when it mattered most. At 71, Nadia no longer measured her life by what she had given up, but by what she had reclaimed. Autonomy, dignity, joy. She understood now that endings were not failures, but thresholds, and that stepping through them required courage she had always possessed, even when she did not recognize it. When the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the garden, Nadia would sometimes think of the doctor who had slipped her the note, of the moment that had changed everything. She would smile softly, grateful not just for the warning, but for the strength it awakened. And as she went inside, locking the door behind her with a satisfied click, she carried with her the knowledge that her life, finally, belonged wholly and unquestionably to her.